Chapter 26, The Ultimate Test. Yes, that's two ultimates. The word ultimate has two meanings. It could mean final or it could mean most important. The stairway quiz was both. It was the final event of the third day and it counted double. The students were worn out before they started. They had already had the science crawl, right and left handwriting, animal imitations, upside down singing, and blindfolded smelling. The stairway quiz would require knowledge, stamina, and most important, speed. That was Dee Dee's special talent. Dee Dee was a pretty fast runner on flat ground, but she was even faster going up and down stairs. That was because her left leg was a little bit shorter than her right. Or maybe it was the other way around. Either way, it gave her an obvious advantage. Louis, the art teacher, stood next to the bottom step. "On your mark," he called out. "Get set!" And Louis blew the whistle. The children rushed past him, knees pumping and elbows flailing. Dee Dee started way back in the pack, but besides her uneven legs, she had another advantage. She was skinny and short. She could squeeze past the slower kids ahead of her. And they were all slower than Dee Dee. And as she neared the third floor, only Damien remained ahead of her. A man with a black mustache was on the landing. "How many quarts in a gallon?" he asked Damien. "8," said Damien. Damien was sent back down to the first floor. "Name a city in England," he said to Dee Dee. "London!" Dee Dee shouted. Then she continued up. Dr. Pickle was waiting on the fourth floor. "Are dreams real?" he said. Dee Dee was stumped. She could hear the other kids coming up the stairs behind her. She hated to have to go back down. "They're real dreams," she said. Dr. Pickle rubbed his beard. "Very interesting answer," he said, and let her pass. By the time she reached the 9th floor, she could only hear distant footsteps behind her. "What do you call someone who writes books?" asked Mrs. Surlaw. "You don't call them," said Dee Dee. "You must never interrupt a great author during her moment of inspiration." I think you said the correct answer in there somewhere," the librarian decided. On the 12th floor, the man with the mustache was waiting again. Dee Dee wondered how he'd gotten ahead of her. "Name the largest river in the United States." Dee Dee couldn't remember its name, but she knew how to spell it. Mississippi. Miss Mush asked the question on the 15th floor. "How many points on a fork?" Dee Dee formed a picture of a fork in her mind, but when she tried to count the points, they blurred. "3?" she tried. "I'm so sorry, Dee Dee," said Miss Mush. She didn't have to go all the way back down to the bottom, just to the 10th. Ron was coming up the other way. "Hi, Dee Dee," he greeted her. "Hi, Ron," said Dee Dee. "Hope you studied your forks and spoons." She reached the 10th, answered another question there, and then again on the 11th and the 12th. Ron was coming down. "Hi, Ron." "Hi, Dee Dee." She reached Miss Mush a second time. "What was Christopher Columbus's favorite vegetable?" asked the lunch lady. Dee Dee knew that one. "Cabbage." She had spent 2 whole nights studying the history of cabbage. She reached the 18th floor. The man with the mustache was there again. "Are zebras black with white stripes or white with black stripes?" Dee Dee thought it was the same thing, but knew that had to be wrong. The first one, she guessed. Was that white with black stripes or black with white stripes? "I don't remember," said Dee Dee. "Me neither," the man admitted, and let her pass. A tall, thin woman asked the next question. She looked like a teacher, but Dee Dee had never seen her before. Strangely, the woman had one very long fingernail on her pinky. "Please recite the alphabet backwards." Dee Dee had to close her eyes to concentrate. CYX. It took her a long time. In her mind, Dee Dee had to keep saying the alphabet forward in order to figure out the next backward letter. She could hear footsteps coming closer, and then Mauricia came up alongside her. "What are you stopping for?" Mauricia asked. Dee Dee looked around. The woman with the long fingernail was gone. CBA, she finished, just in case. Dee Dee and Mauricia continued up together, reaching the 20th floor at the same time. The mustache man was back again. How many toes does a three-toed sloth have? He asked. That had to be the easiest question yet, thought Dee Dee. 3, she said. 12, said Mauricia. Dee Dee was sent back down to the 15th floor. Now she really had to turn on the jets. She leaped around and over the other kids on her way down, and then, using her uneven legs, she practically flew back up the stairs as she answered all the questions correctly. She shot past Mauricia between 28th and the 29th floors, answered a question about the different kinds of dirt, and then finally reached the top of the stairs where Mrs. Jules was waiting. How many points on a fork? Mrs. Jules asked. I already had that question, Dee Dee said as she took several long, deep breaths. Her heart was pounding. Good, then you'll know the answer. Once again, Dee Dee tried to picture a fork in her mind. It was either 3 or 4. 12, she declared, still confused about the sloth, with its 3 toes and 4 feet. She trudged back down. Hi, Dee Dee, said Mauricia on her way up. Dee Dee didn't say hi back. After school, only 3 of the Unbreakables could be seen by the flagpole. Mauricia was still inside the school. Photographers were snapping her picture, and she was being questioned by the newspaper reporters from all over the world. When she finally came outside, she was carrying a giant trophy. Oh, sorry I took so long, she said. You must think you're really great, said Joy. Mauricia shrugged. Well, you should, said Ron. Because you are, said Dee Dee. Mauricia set down her trophy and said, You guys are the greatest friends ever. They held out their hands, locked pinkies and thumbs, and shouted, Unbreakable. Friends stick by each other when one is down. That is a true test of friendship. But sometimes it is harder to stick by a friend who is up. That is the ultimate test of friendship. Chapter 27, Kasuga Boop. The ultimate test was over, and nobody was sent back to kindergarten. Mrs. Jules had made up the test so that every one of her students had a chance to shine, using his or her special talent. Anyone with nail clippings? She asked. Myron came to the front of the room and dropped 37 clippings in the nail bucket. 19 came from toes, and 18 came from fingers. He started to do the math on the board. There's his math. 999,962 plus 37. He was suddenly startled by a very loud Kasuga Boop, and he dropped the chalk. Oops. There was a bell nobody in the class had heard before, not even Mrs. Jules. Then came another Kasuga, followed by 2 boops. What does it mean, Mrs. Jules? Shouted Leslie. Everybody keep calm, said Mrs. Jules. Kasuga Boop, boop, boop. Mrs. Jules hurried back to the closet. It started up again. Kasuga Boop, Kasuga Boop, boop. Mrs. Jules threw open the closet door and started tossing books and supplies out of the way. Kasuga Boop, boop, boop. She finally removed a very large book covered with dust. The Complete Guide to Bells, said Terence, reading the book's title over Mrs. Jules' shoulder. Mrs. Jules sat on the floor turning the pages until she got to the index. The Kasuga booping continued, making it difficult for her to concentrate. She found it. Kasuga Boop, page 297. She quickly turned to that page. Suddenly, a loud boom shook the classroom. The lights went out. This time, nobody screamed. They were too scared. Mrs. Jules lit a candle. In the flickering light, she could read aloud from page 297. If you hear a Kasuga followed by 1, 2, and then 3 boops, you should... And she stopped and blew a cloud of dust off the page, then tried to find where she had left off. 1, 2, and then 3 boops. You should run for your lives. A cloud of doom is about to destroy everything. She dropped the book. Everybody outside, she ordered. Another boom shook the classroom so hard the clock fell off the wall. The children ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. "Oh man, the paperclip closet must have fallen over," said Damien. "It's blocking the door." "Paperclip closet?" asked Mrs. Jules, and she glared at Jason. "Sorry," he said. Jason couldn't keep a secret. Todd, Maricia, Damien, and Allison all pushed together, and the door wouldn't budge. "Hey, let Steven in there," urged Kathy. "He's been doing all those push-downs." With Steven's help, they pushed the door open. Sirens wailed from the closet, the one outside her door, which lay on the ground. A smoke screen filled the area. In the light of Mrs. Jules' candle, they could see that the chains and the steel bar had been shattered. Paper clips were strewn all over the floor. Benjamin and Rondi started to pick them up. "Leave them!" shouted Mrs. Jules. Now they knew this was serious. Mrs. Jules told everyone to hold hands as they led the way down the staircase. Paul grabbed Leslie's pigtail. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Well, it's either that or your hand," he said. "Okay," Leslie agreed. The Kasuga booping continued as more loud booms shook the school. A gust of wind blew Mrs. Jules' candle out, and the class continued down in darkness. Joe stepped on a skateboard, which somebody had left in the middle of the stairs. He fell, pulling John down with him, who pulled down Dana, who pulled down Jenny, who pulled down Rondi, who pulled down Terrence. The chain reaction ended with Damien pulling down Mrs. Jules. The class lay sprawled across the stairs as the school shook around them. "We're doomed," Mac wailed. "Look," exclaimed Bibi. A door had opened and there was a light coming from inside the classroom. A teacher stood in the doorway. "Quick, come inside," she beckoned. "You'll be safe here." She had a long fingernail on her pinky. Chapter 28. The Teacher with the Long Fingernail. Like moths, the children went to the light. "Welcome, welcome, glad you're here. Come in," the woman said as they filed past and joined the other kids in her class. "I'm sorry I don't have enough desks, but we'll make do. Please find a place on the floor for now." The children did as they were told. They felt safe, even if a bit uncomfortable. They could no longer feel the school shaking or hear the Kasuga boops. "Miss Zarves," said Mrs. Jules, "it is so good to see you. How long has it been?" "Feels like forever," said Miss Zarves. "I never bump into you in the teacher's lounge," said Mrs. Jules. We must keep missing each other." "Oh, I try not to bump into people," said Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves was tall and thin. Her skirt and blouse were neat and trim. Her short hair looked like shiny and silky and smelled like strawberry shampoo. Everything about her was neat and orderly except for her one fingernail. "And how's Mavis?" asked Mrs. Zarves. Mavis was Mrs. Jules' daughter. "Adorable," said Mrs. Jules, "but they grow up so fast, don't they?" "Oh, I wouldn't know," said Miss Zarves. "You don't look like you've aged a day," said Mrs. Jules. "Oh, that's very nice of you to say," said Miss Zarves. Mrs. Jules wasn't just being nice. Miss Zarves hadn't changed one bit, except for her fingernail, of course, which had grown considerably longer. Calvin walked between the two teachers. Excuse me, Miss Zarves," he said. "I think I'm supposed to give you this." He handed Miss Zarves a folded piece of paper that was so old it tore as Miss Zarves unfolded it. She strained to read the faded writing. Do you remember this from the first book? "Oh, okay," she said to Mrs. Jules and dropped the note in the trash. "Is that the note I gave to you to give to Miss Zarves?" Mrs. Jules asked Calvin. Calvin shrugged. I just found it in my pocket," he said, sounding even more surprised than Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules stared at him. "You told me you gave it to her," she accused. I don't think I ever said that," said Calvin. Mrs. Jules continued to stare as he returned to his seat on the floor. We were just about to have our history review, said Miss Sarves. Who's your best history student? Oh, Myron, said Mrs. Jules, without any hesitation. Myron had gotten the highest score on the history portion of the ultimate test. Myron, please stand up, said Miss Sarves. He stood. What kind of shoes did Mary Bobkins like to wear? Miss Sarves asked him. Who? Asked Myron. The kids from Miss Sarves' class giggled. No laughing, said Miss Sarves. We don't laugh at stupid people. But once you've been in my class for a few years, you'll know the history of everybody, Mark. Would you please tell Myron the answer? A few years? Myron asked, but Miss Sarves ignored that question. Mark Miller stood up. Which Mary Bobkins do you mean? He asked. The one born in 1801 in Boston or the one born in 1954 in San Francisco? Boston, said Miss Sarves. Red boots, said Mark. Excellent, said Miss Sarves. Who is Mary Bobkins? Asked Mrs. Jules. Was she famous? Why, asked Miss Sarves, does your class only study famous people? Do you think famous people are more important than people who aren't famous? But there isn't enough time to study everyone, said Mrs. Jules. We don't play favorites in my class, said Miss Sarves. She went to the back closet and took out several giant stacks of papers. This is everyone born in 1837. She went around the room handing each student a stack of 100 pages or more. When you finish studying a page, please pass it to someone else. Myron stared helplessly at his stack. I can't even read this, he complained. I think this is in Chinese. Well, a lot of people were born in China, said Miss Sarves. She handed Myron a Chinese dictionary and said, You're going to need this. It is impossible to say how long Myron sat there, fumbling through the dictionary as the kids around him were passing around their sheets of paper. He might have been there an hour or a day or a week. Time passes slowly when you're trying to read a Chinese dictionary, even if you're Chinese. He glanced up and spotted a pair of scissors on Mark Miller's desk. He got an idea. Hey, Mark, can I borrow those for a sec? Myron asked. Sure, said Mark. Myron took the scissors and walked bravely to the front of the room. He didn't know if his plan would work. In fact, it really didn't make any sense, but it was his only HOPE. Excuse me, Miss Sarves. I can trim your fingernail for you. If you like, he offered. My fingernail? Asked Miss Sarves, astonished by such a suggestion. Which one are you talking about? The long one on the end there, said Myron. Miss Sarves looked at her hand. Now that you mention it, it has gotten a little long. I guess I hadn't noticed because it was growing so slowly. She held out her hand. Myron pressed hard on the scissors and snipped it off. Oh, that does feel better, said Miss Sarves. Thank you, Myron. Myron held the fingernail up in the air. Except he was no longer standing in front of the classroom. He was standing on the stairs, and everyone else from Mrs. Jules' class lay sprawled across the staircase. 1,000,000! He shouted triumphantly. Chapter 29. After the storm. The boops and booms had stopped, and the lights were back on. Myron and the others had to step over all the sorts of objects as they made their way back up toward the classroom. The stairs were strewn with books, papers, cafeteria trays, musical instruments, an air pump, a giant stuffed walrus, and even a bust of Sigmund Freud. Between the 26th and 27th floors, the stairs were completely blocked off by Mr. Kidswatter's enormous desk. They all had fun climbing over it, including Mrs. Jules. Once back in class, Myron dropped Miss Sarves' fingernail into the bucket, which unfortunately was empty. Sadly, the other 900,999 clippings were gone. Myron would have written 1,000,000 on the blackboard anyway, but there was no blackboard. The chalk was there, however. It was as if everything inside Wayside School had been shuffled like a deck of cards and dealt randomly to every floor. Mrs. Jules' whiteboard was eventually discovered in the library. Fingernails and toenails would continue to be found for years to come, sometimes in very strange places. The sun shined. The sky was as blue as Allison's eyes. Birds chirped as they flew about. There had been no birds during the dark days of doom. Lewis, the art teacher, shoveled snow off the roof. Among other things, the cloud had dumped huge amounts of snow. The playground sparkled white. Lewis had to be careful. The snow was packed high above the guardrails and was very slippery. "Look out below!" he shouted as he tossed a shovelful of snow over the edge. Down below, the kids were playing a kind of reverse dodgeball. It was boys against the girls. Every time Lewis shouted, "Look out below!" they did the opposite. Eric Ovens charged past Jenny and dived face first, sliding across the snow-covered ground. Lewis's clump smacked him right on the head. "1 point," he explained. Recess was 3 hours today. The kids had to be sent out to play while the teachers were stuck cleaning up the mess made by the storm. Just as Mrs. Jules had predicted, now that the cloud of doom was gone, the world had become a happier place. The only thing missing was a rainbow. "Look out below!" Lewis called from another side of the school. They raced around the building. Leslie dived toward the falling clump. "1 point," she declared. "No way, Miss Piggytail," said Terence. "It missed you." "It did not," Leslie insisted. "See, look at the snow in my hair." "That's ground snow," argued Terence. Dana came to Leslie's defense. "Some of it came from the ground," she agreed, "but 4 flakes came from the air. I saw them." "How can you see 4 snowflakes?" asked Paul. "Super glasses," said Dana, pointing to her spectacles. She picked 4 snowflakes out of Leslie's hair. 1, 2, 3, 4, just like I told you. "That proves it," declared BB. 1 point. Paul scowled. He remained skeptical of those spectacles. Up on the roof, Lewis spotted something sticking out of the snow. It was purple and green, with some yellow dots. He tried to pull it free, but it was stuck. He pulled hard. It wouldn't budge. He gave it one hard yank, and the umbrella jerked free, but Lewis's feet slipped out from under him. He fell on his bottom and slid backward across the roof. "Look out below!" he shouted as he went over the edge. Chapter 30, the last chapter. No. Rainbow. There was no stove in the cafeteria kitchen. An enormous pot hung from a thick chain above a blazing fire. "Lower the pot," ordered Miss Mush. Mr. Pepperadder turned the squeaky crank and the pot came down. "What will it be today?" he asked. "Shh," said Miss Mush. Mr. Pepperadder knew better. You must never interrupt a great artist during her moment of inspiration. Miss Mush's eyes were closed. She rubbed her chin. She wanted to make something truly special after the storm of doom. "Rainbow stew," she declared as she raised her wooden spoon high above her head. "Brilliant," agreed Mr. Pepperadder. "What do we have that's red?" asked Miss Mush. Mr. Pepperadder looked over his inventory list. "Red cabbage," he said. "Beets, strawberries, red peppers." Miss Mush waved the spoon and said, "Toss 'em in the pot." Flames shot up as Mr. Pepperadder threw in the ingredients. He had to shield his eyes from the smoke. "What about yellow?" said Miss Mush. "Yellow squash, banana, yellow peppers, yellow onions." "Oh, start with the bananas," said Miss Mush. "And then we'll see about the onions." Mr. Pepperadder started to peel a banana, but Miss Mush stopped him. "The peel is the part that's yellow," she reminded him. "If I wanted white, I would have asked for peeled bananas." "Oh, sorry," said Mr. Pepperadder, and he tossed 57 bushels of bananas, peels and all, into the pot. There was a loud hissing noise as steam filled the room. Some cooks considered things like taste or perhaps nutrition when preparing a meal. For rainbow stew, color was all that mattered. Miss Mush stirred the pot with a large stick. Perhaps a little black now, for definition, she said. Mr. Pepperadder read from his list. Poppy seeds, burnt toast, my shoes. High above them in Mrs. Jules' class, several children held their noses. What's that smell? Asked Calvin. Miss Mush must be cooking something, said BB. It smells like shoes, said Myron. DJ sniffed. Black shoes, he said, with hard soles and no laces. You can smell the laces? Asked Kathy. No, said DJ. I just told you there weren't any laces. Mr. Kidswatter's voice came over the speaker. Good morning, students. It's another great day here at... There was a sound of paper rustling. Wayside School. For lunch today, Miss Mush will be serving rainbow stew. It will be the greatest lunch ever. 15 floors beneath them, Miss Mush felt her stomach tighten. She, too, heard Mr. Kidswatter's morning announcement. Now the pressure was on. She climbed a ladder and stared down into the bubbling pot. Her face was covered with soot and sweat. Something orange, she decided. How about oranges? Suggested Mr. Pepperadder. Too obvious, said Miss Mush. Carrots? I suppose, said Miss Mush, although carrots didn't feel right to her. Inspiration struck. 18 pumpkins, she exclaimed. Each pumpkin made a giant splash as Miss Mush and Mr. Pepperadder took turns tossing them in the pot. After all the pumpkins were added to the stew, a tiny smile crept across Miss Mush's face. It was a smile that had all great artists know very well. After years of self-doubt, she started to believe that she was on the verge of creating something truly wonderful. But it was just a quick smile, then back to work. The doubts always return. The lunch bell kaboinked. The children descended upon the cafeteria. Rainbow stew, said Benjamin. Sounds like it could be good. Don't let the name fool you, warned Todd. The better the name, the worse it tastes. Remember when she made Midnight Madness? Asked Paul. Don't even say it, snapped Leslie. I was up all night running in circles. Miss Mush and Mr. Pepperadder stood shoulder to shoulder as the children lined up. They had finished the stew only moments before. I hope they like it, Miss Mush whispered. They will, Mr. Pepperadder assured her. He wore short pants, black socks, and no shoes. Miss Mush hoped he was right, but all her doubts had returned. Her apron was splotched with lots of bright colors, but the rainbow stew looked like lumpy, grayish-brown mud. She didn't understand it. What happened to all the colors? Mauricia reached the front of the line. Miss Mush scooped some rainbow stew into a bowl and handed it to her. Thank you, Miss Mush, said Mauricia, always polite. Sorry, it was supposed to be a bit more colorful, exclaimed Miss Mush. I don't know what went wrong. Joy was next. Sorry, Miss Mush said again as she handed a bowl to Joy. Sorry, Ron, she said. Sorry, Dee Dee. Sorry, Joe. Sorry, John. Sorry. Allison and Rondi sat at one end of the table. Are you going to eat it? Rondi asked Allison. I have a tangerine in my pocket, said Allison. Maybe I'll just eat that. Rondi watched as Allison slowly removed the entire peel in just one piece. Dee Dee counted the points on her fork. DJ swirled the plastic fork through the gray muck. Well, here goes, he announced. He poked his fork into something solid. It could have been a vegetable, or maybe a piece of meat, or perhaps a part of a shoe. He lowered his fork. Yeah, maybe later, he said. It looks delicious, Kathy said enthusiastically. She took a big spoonful, brought it to her mouth, and swallowed. Yummy, she declared. The other kids couldn't be sure. They could never tell anymore when Kathy was speaking in opposites. Calvin stabbed something gooey in his fork, brought it to his mouth, chewed a while, chewed some more. Well, asked BB. Calvin wasn't sure how to describe it. Red, he said at last. Red? Questioned Allison. That's a color, not a taste. Ah, blue, said Calvin. Rondi took a bite. She chewed a while. purple, she declared. I taste yellow, said Todd. Dana swallowed. Pink, she exclaimed. John finished chewing and then swallowed. Kind of blue-green, he said. It's delicious, said Sherry. Purple and green with yellow polka dots. The more they chewed, the more colors they tasted. That's silly, said Allison. She took a bite. Her eyes shone. She tasted orange with green and purple stripes and black outline. Do you like it? Asked Rondi. Only the best lunch ever, said Allison. Mr. Pepper-Ratter grabbed and shook Miss Mush's arm. They like it, he said excitedly. Look at them. They really like it. Miss Mush didn't say a word. A tear rolled down her sweaty, sooty cheek. Did you write down the recipe? He asked. Miss Mush shook her head. There is no recipe, she whispered. No two rainbows are the same. She gazed out across the lunchroom. This was all she's ever wanted. Everybody chewed. That's it. We're done. No more. That was fun. I enjoyed sharing that with you.